So at the beginning of part four, he opens up with two Latin phrases, which are worth sort of looking at because one of them kind of covers the whole of what he's trying to do in this section. So he first talks about ex opere operato and then ex opere operantis. The difference between these two is essentially how grace is funneled into our lives. So the first one has to do with the sacraments themselves. So it just simply means by the work done. So grace is objectively in the act, in the sacrament, and we receive grace from it based upon our disposition. The second, the ex opere operantis, has to do with it's by virtue of the worker doing the work. Okay, so it matters. So the gist of the whole chapter is based on this. So what he's trying to get in us is this sort of desire to be these overflowing sort of vessels of grace, and how we bring grace to other people, because that's ultimately what the apostolate is, right? So the apostolate is not um, just preaching, but it's actually being this sort of conduit of grace, um, and bringing graces into people's lives, because God wants to make everyone cooperators with him. So that's why he sort of starts it with that. It seems like a tangent at first, but he's just trying to sort of get us to begin to think about how we can personally be vessels of grace to other people. Um, and his sort of proof text for that is just what Jesus says when he says, "Whoever abides in me bears much fruit." Um, and there's a little story in there where he talks about how there's these two orphanages, and the girls coming out of them are, kind of, they go out and they sort of just, they become, they live loosely after they leave. But then when the rector and the formators are changed, and both the rector and the formators are sort of men and women of prayer, the young girls coming out of there are totally different. And so the only difference is just the fact that they were men and women in prayer. And then he sort of goes on and he talks a little bit about what John of the Cross says when he said, essentially, we would be much more useful to the church and more pleasing to God if we devote more time to prayer and to the exercises of the interior life. And then, so what he wants us to do is really be sort of convinced of this, that we're actually way more effective in our prayers saving people, right? And I think the first night we met, we sort of talked about the example of Saint Therese and how she wanted to be this great missionary, and she gets she never leaves the convent, but nevertheless she's given this grace where God tells her how many souls her prayers have saved. And so she had that great zeal for souls, and she poured it into prayer. Um, and so he's trying to get us to keep that always in mind. Um, and so what John of the Cross is saying is that without prayer, sort of all we do just amounts to just a bunch of noise. And he has that little image in the book of like a hammer hammering against an anvil, right? So a hammer hitting an anvil is not going to do anything, right? Um, all it's going to do is just make a whole bunch of noise. And that's what he's trying to sort of tell us, that without prayer, no matter what we do, um, we can't give what we don't have. Okay. And so with that sort of principle, which he has literally like hammered home at this point, um, he wants us to sort of look at all the causes that lead to sort of fruitfulness in the interior life. And he has 7 or 8 of them. We're going to talk about 4 of them. Okay, so it was kind of a long chapter, but I think the first 2 or 3 are really good, and then I want to talk at the end about sort of making the Eucharist the center of our spirituality, and how we might do that. Okay, so he starts with the first one is that the interior life draws down blessings from God, and he says all true apostolic workers expect much more from their sacrifices and prayers than from their work. All right, and he goes on to quote St. Bonaventure, who says, "The secret of a fruitful apostolate is to be found much more at the foot of the cross than in the display of brilliance." Right, so we all know this, like, intuitively, right? Like, we all sort of go, yeah, I know that's true. I know that it's God doing it, not me doing it. But again, if we sort of go full circle back to what we talked about the first night we met, was it's one thing to sort of to know something intellectually, but we're trying to move it from the head to the heart, where it's something we firmly and truthfully believe, right? And the way we know that is because our actions begin to sort of betray what we really believe, right? And so we find ourselves being drawn more and more to prayer, when and less to action, when we know someone needs something and we're not in a position to help them immediately, right? Or when we have our we're going to have our small group meeting, and we decide, okay, I need to go and spend an hour before the Blessed Sacrament, if I'm really going to sort of be this vessel of grace. And that's sort of when we begin to really make changes, is when we become sort of utterly convinced. And I think we've talked about this before, but a lot of the spiritual life, is sort of fake it till you make it, and where we go, okay, I don't believe this as firmly as I should, but I'm going to do it as if I do believe it as firmly as I should, and then suddenly we're changed by it, right? So you're sort of again going back and asking God, just saying, I want this, so make me want it. All right, I know this is the right thing to do, and I know this is the right thing to have, but I'm just not there yet. And God, that sort of principle of gradualism he uses, kind of moves us along slowly. All right, and so if we begin to then see, that hour in front of the Blessed Sacrament, for example, is the time where we go and we gather up all the blessings that God wants to give all the people in our small group. We take them and we gather them up, and then we distribute them when we get there, right? And so um, that image of God could do it without you, but He's not going to, right? And so we have to keep that always in mind. Um, and the more and more we experience it, the more and more we realize, okay, this is really true, and we begin to sort of set our life around it, right? I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience where you've prayed about something, and then you get in the moment, and things go differently than you expected, but they go better than you expected, right? And you either said something or did something that you had no idea you were going to do, or didn't even know you knew, but nevertheless, you just sort of, um, God had hidden these graces deep inside of our soul in that moment of prayer, and it came out when we needed it. All right, and so that's what I think we talked about, staying motivated to do our mental prayer in the morning, and one of the ways is to know that, this is the moment of the day where God's going to give me all the graces I need for today. So I need to be there. I need to be there on my knees in front of the crucifix, praying, to gather up those graces that I'm going to need today. All right. Um, there's another part too, that he talks about, which is worth sort of diving into just a little bit. Um, and he talks about it sort of almost as a side note, but I think it's good for us to talk about when he talks about suffering, okay, and how suffering, along with prayer, has this sort of this built-in fruitfulness to it. In fact, I think he even calls suffering a sacrament. So in other words, like a sign that delivers grace to other people. Um, and he asked the question, he's like, okay, how do we suffer? Do we suffer like a pagan, somebody who's damned, or like a saint? Right? And so what are the difference between those three? Well, a pagan, sort of suffers, begrudgingly, kind of looks at it as something to be totally avoided. And when, it actually comes, it's simply meaningless, right? And so it's something to be avoided. It's something that, if for some reason it has to happen, it's meaningless. And the damned, obviously, suffering is just pure misery, right? But the saint, which is hopefully what we're all striving for, is the one who suffers with Christ in order to finish the job that Christ started, right? So think about that line. I think it's Colossians 1:24, where St. Paul talks about that, he's completing what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ, right? So Christ, um, suffers on the cross and gives suffering this eternal value, right? And so now when we suffer with him, uh, that suffering becomes currency that we can purchase souls, right, for him, right? So Christ is sort of the gold standard, and he gives us all this currency, of suffering in our lives, and we can take that suffering and use it to save souls, right? And this, if you guys know the story of the children, um, at Fatima, they sort of they exhibit this really beautifully, where they find out that, when they meet the angel, first angel of Portugal, he tells them to do penance, and they don't really know sort of how they do it, but the first time Our Lady comes, she sort of instructs them on how to do penance, and she tells them that by their sufferings, souls will be saved. And so, once they find that out, they're doing like crazy things, like they're giving their lunches away every day. They're wearing these little these belts, like rope tied around their waist, super tight. And in fact, like in one of the times Our Lady appears to him, she has to tell the little boy, like, "Hey, stop tying it so tight. You're gonna really hurt yourself." Right? But they learn that their suffering can be used to save souls, right? And when we finally grasp that, we may not put on the rope and tie it really around our waist, but we won't run from the suffering that God sends us, right? We'll see it as a grace and a gift, and we'll take it, and we'll use it, and we'll unite it with Christ, and we'll use it to save souls, right? And that dignity that it gives us to kind of share in His mission, again, more souls are brought that way than any other way. And so suffering is sort of like this glue that holds us all together, right? That Christ uses. And it's, again, as like St. Paul says, he says, if we suffer with Him, we'll also reign with Him. And so we have to get in the habit of not running away from suffering, right? And I think we talked about the first or second time we met about, I think we were talking about discernment, and when, you get to the end and you're trying to decide between two things. And I said, always choose the thing that has the more of the cross in it, right? Because a cross means that, there's sanctifying fruit with it. And so if we can get in the habit of always looking at two things and always choosing the thing that has more of the cross in it, right? And so, so we have to get in the habit of not be, to be unafraid of suffering. And one of the ways to do that is not to let your imagination get away with you. I know there's a tendency to, like, you're like, okay, well, what if I tell God it's okay that I suffer, and then He sends me like this horrible plague or something, right? And we can do that, where we kind of think, well, he's gonna ask a lot, and we get really scared. But that tends not to be how He operates, right? Where He sort of just, He gives us what we need when we need it, and when it's necessary, right? So yeah, so I think that aspect of it is one of the things that helps us get over the fear. All right, so there's a second thing that he talks about, and he says that that the interior life makes the apostle capable of sanctifying others by his example. Okay, so what he's trying to say is not like the example per se of a person who prays, although that's really important, but there's a tendency where people, I think they will quote St. Francis, where they'll say um, like preach the gospel, speak words if necessary, or something like that, right? And actually, St. Francis didn't ever actually say that. But their point is, well, like, oh, I don't really have to preach to people. I just have to set a good example, right? And part of that is I'm not St. Francis, so maybe St. Francis could get away with that because he was a saint and I'm not. But the other part of it is that we sort of have to do both, right? And so he's thinking example in the big sense of like how you live your life and how you're ready to preach when it's necessary. But he's saying that only when we have a deep interior life will our actions be capable of sanctifying other people. And he has a quote in there. He says, the one thing most likely to induce the faithful to lead a really Christian life is precisely the virtue of the one charged with teaching it, right? And so, I think we've all had that experience where we've met someone and we're like, I'm in the presence of somebody who's holy. And it just has this natural sort of, you naturally gravitate towards them, and you want to do whatever they say or whatever they want, right? And so then the idea then of that person spent a lot of time in prayer, a lot of time face to face with God. And so we talked a lot about it the first time about zeal, right? About how we capture zeal, and we said, well, we're trying to get a hold of the zeal that Christ had, right? But the surest sign of zeal is our desire to be holy, like our desire to spend the time with Jesus, and the desire to spread all the blessings He's pouring into our hands to give to other people. Okay, um, so so his point is, again, he's pulling out of the gospel, right, where Christ talks about being salt of the earth. And he's just saying that, it's not enough to sort of regurgitate what the church teaches. Um, it has to be sort of salted with our personal faith. Um, so that, if I'm preaching something and it's made no difference in my life, why would anyone want to follow me, right? Or why would anyone even be interested? Um, and that's a trap. I mean, that's a trap that the church as a whole sometimes can even fall into, where it's really no different than the world, right? And especially in the way that people live. And so the only way, the witness of personal faith, that you take your life and you adhere to it, and then preach it, is when it's effective. Okay. Um, and these are just simple examples too, right? Like praying in public. Are you shy to pray in public? And I know of stories. In fact, it's happened to me before, where we'll sit down in a restaurant and we'll pray the blessing, and Catholics pray. It's very obvious they're praying, right? Because they start with the sign of the cross, finish the sign of the cross, and inevitably there'll be times when someone will say something, more to the fact of, oh, are you Catholic? Or um, but nevertheless, um, it's one of those things where we can't be fearful of that, right? Um, and he gives the example of the one of the I think it's the name was like Fabiola or something, where um, she was witnessing all these martyrs in Rome, and eventually she converts because she keeps seeing these people go to death, not fearing anything, and joyful. And um, and in a certain sense, like, that's what we're all called to, right? We're like, we've got to be prepared to become martyrs. And maybe it's not, like, the word martyr really means witness, right? And so when we went through confirmation, we were sort of deputized to become these great witnesses, or these great martyrs. And so we had to rely on the grace of the sacrament of confirmation to sort of carry us through our witness, right? And it always comes in sort of the supernatural way. Then his third one is, he says, it makes the apostle radiate the supernatural, right? And this again goes back to that sort of idea of, when you're around someone that's holy, you know it instantly, right? And he gives the example of Saint John Vianney, right? If you know the story of Saint John Vianney, he was he well, he wanted to be ordained, and I think he's thrown out of 2 or 3 seminaries because he couldn't memorize Latin, and he was really, really pretty slow, and so they basically told him he could never be a priest. Um, and then he goes to I think it's a 4th seminary, and they take him, but then they send him to this, like, tiny town in France called Ars, um, and he goes there, and strictly by his witness of life, like, thousands and thousands of people are coming to him. He's saying he's in the confessional for 13 hours a day, and people are coming miles and miles away to see this holy man, and to go to confession, right? And so it's like a magnet, how it just attracts people. um, I mean, how did people know this tiny town in France, that there was this country priest that was on his way to sainthood, right? And it's because God was using him, whereas the bishop had exiled him there, basically. All right, so he's saying, okay, so that you radiate faith, hope, and charity. All right, and so um, he talks about faith, um, and really what he's sort of getting at here, because he talks about, like, there's all this study going on, and it's even more in our more so in our time, right? There's all these theologians, and there's all this information about the faith, and he says, never has the faith been so dead, right? And why is that? Why? Because it's not an intellectual thing, right? He's like, we really need to be doing theology on our knees, right? Where we take those things and we take them from the head and put them in the heart, and take our entire, like, really, really sort of meditate on them, and deeply take ownership of them, right? That's the beauty of, like, someone like Saint Thomas, for example, right? Like, Saint Thomas spent hours and hours and days in prayer, and he would get to something he couldn't understand, and he'd just go to the Blessed Sacrament. He'd stay there until he got his answer. And there's just, like, so many examples of it. Like, one time he was struggling with something in one of St. Paul's writings. I don't remember exactly what it was, and he couldn't grasp it. And he just kept praying and praying and praying. And finally, St. Paul appears to him and tells him what it means. Right? And he immediately puts it in his, his commentary. And so there's a beauty to that where, he's wrestling with this, not because it's some intellectual problem. It's because he wants to be a saint. Right. And so, we can never forget that as we dive into our formation, like, what's the purpose, right? The purpose is having more reasons to love God, right? The more you know about someone, the more you love. And so if we go into our study, thinking, okay, I just want another reason to be amazed and wowed by God. And then it really bears fruit in our life, right? He says that it's impossible for a man of prayer not to radiate hope. Okay, so what does hope look like? Hope looks like having a supernatural outlook on everything, right? To see the hand of God in everything, right? Even in the midst, like, now it's especially, right, like we as Catholics have to be these unbelievable beacons of hope, because everyone is despairing, right? And then they see these Catholics who've put all their trust in Christ, like, being beacons of hope and seeing the supernatural meaning in this, and not worrying about uh, you know a virus, when we have, when we have the God of the universe who stomped on death. We're not worried about a virus, right? And people need to know that, need to see that. And not that we're careless or reckless about it, but nevertheless, we know that death is not the worst thing that can happen to us, and nor is it the end, right? And so, um, so when you have a supernatural outlook on things, when you're always going, what is God doing here? What comes with that is always peace, right? Like, God has made a promise to me, and He's always faithful to His promises. All I have to do is be faithful in return, and that brings us peace, right, in the midst of just total turmoil. And as the world turns more away from God, those lights of hope are going to be more and more important, right? So not hiding ourselves, our light, under the bushel basket. And then finally, he talks about charity, how everything we do has to connect back to the love of God, right? Because He's the reason why we do everything, and He's the one who allows us to do everything. And so, even things like punishments, right? We see them as coming from the hand of God for our best. Um, and in the book, he talks about having this sort of, he goes on a lot about kindness and what it looks like, right? How we respond to people matters. He talks about being tirelessly and heroically kind. And he says, I think he's quoting either John of the Cross, or it might be Father Faber, where he talks about, to be kind is to put oneself in the place of the other. All right. And so when, even when we have to be firm and we have to correct people, it's always done with the idea of winning them over, right? So remember, I think we talked about last time we met, we talked about, like, the difference between, like, a Catholic and just a person in the world, right? So a Catholic has enemies just like everybody else, but the difference is he's always trying to win his enemies over. And so, so having this idea of kindness, of realizing, even in this moment, like, I have to bring Christ to them, and having the courage to do that, and having the humility, which is the next part he talks about, to set your own self aside and realize, I have to win this soul over. And again, that only happens when we've really spent time in prayer, and we're really secure in who we are in God's eyes, right? Because if we have God's approval, who else's approval do we need, right? If God is on our side, why would we need to defend ourselves? And when we're comfortable in our own skin, because we've sat and we've talked to God, and we know who we are, that's a game changer. All right. And so he says, with respect to humility, he says, we'll never be any use in doing God's work until we become thoroughly convinced that of ourselves we are better fitted to ruin everything than to make a success of it. Right. And this is Saint Philip Neri, who each day's prayer in the morning would be, watch out, Jesus, because Philip's going to betray you today if you let him. Right. And so this utter dependence of just knowing what you're totally capable of, and what level of depravity you're capable of, and then just understanding, like, what the grace of God has turned you into. And that ought to keep us humble, right? That ought to keep us humble in understanding where our gifts are, but radically depending upon God, and making sure that everything sort of points back to Him, right? And even in the sense of, even when we're criticized, the truly humble person, when they're criticized, even if it's harsh, right? They'll look for the truth in it, and they'll be grateful to the person for correcting them, even if it came across harsh, right? And so that has to be what we're looking for, right? That stability of having God tell us who we are. Um, then what other people say, we're grateful when it's something that helps us, even if it hurt our feelings. And he even says, like, okay, hurt feelings are one of the signs that you're working for yourself and not for God. Um, okay, so that's sort of that part of it. What I want to end with is the part where he talks about having this attitude to understand that everything we do in the apostolate depends on a life centered on the Blessed Sacrament. And if you think about it, of course, this makes perfect sense, right? It makes perfect sense that if the entire point of the interior life is to put on Christ, well, that's what we're doing literally when we receive the Eucharist, right? And so there's a part of that of course makes sense, but what we're trying to do is get out of the intellectual part and really take our life and structure it around a love for Jesus in the Eucharist, right? Because when our Lord was at the Last Supper, like the first words out of his mouth to the apostles were, "I've earnestly desired to eat this meal with you," and he earnestly desired it because of what he was going to give, right? And he earnestly desired it because, again, in that moment, he saw every one of our communions. Every time we saw communion, he saw, what our response would be, what our love would be. And so for us to grasp that and understand that he's been waiting, for us to go to communion so that he can give himself completely and totally, right? Um, and uh, and Father Chittard says, if our whole redemption gravitates about Calvary, all the graces of the mystery flow down upon us from the altar, right? So the Eucharist is the place we go to get the fruit from the cross, right? And so when we go to Mass and we're sitting there, especially during the consecration, and we're on our knees, we are, physically in the church, but we are, mystically and sacramentally at the foot of the cross, with Our Lady, um, and waiting for the fruit to come from the cross, right? And we're offering him to the Father, but we're also waiting for that. And so everything we have, right? That's why the Catholics call it the source and the summit. Everything comes from the Eucharist, right? And so we have to have this Eucharistic spirituality, um, where and he has these beautiful images too, where he talks about, he's using this image of like staying warm, right? And he's saying, okay, if you want to stay warm-blooded, then you have to imbibe the blood of Christ, right? So only then do we become warm-blooded. And he says, well, it's impossible to stay on fire without the Eucharist. And when our life revolves around the Eucharist, right? Like even now, when it's hard to receive, when there's no Mass, like we need to be just extending our desire for Christ in the Eucharist. We need to be making spiritual communions several times a day, every time it comes to mind, so that when that next communion comes, we will not only be ready, but our hearts will just be bursting open, right, for His life to go in. And so, when things do get back to normal, especially, I mean, it's relatively easy for you all to get the daily Mass. Like that needs to be a part of your spirituality, and just understand how desperately you need that, and what an unbelievable gift it is. Um, and so, our own time is a little different than, even his time, which is 150 years ago. Like people have much more access to Mass, to daily Mass, and to the Eucharist than they did, in any other time in the history of the church, right? And so God providentially has set it up that way, right? Where we have this sort of de-Christianization of society, and then we have a Pope who became a saint, Pope Saint Pius X, right around the turn of the 20th century, writes this encyclical on the Eucharist, and he's basically begging people to go to daily Mass and receive the Eucharist daily, because sort of in his role as Pope, he could see what was coming, right? And so the Eucharist becomes this shield for us, um, from the outside culture. It sets us on fire and makes us want to keep running back and forth, right? Like to the Eucharist, to prayer, to our apostolate, to Eucharist, to prayer, to our apostolate, right? And that whole idea, it's like this fuel that keeps on fueling us. All right, that is all I got. That chapter was kind of long, so if I skip something you guys want to talk about, feel free to say something, or if you had any other questions too.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
All right. So we were talking about what Saint Francis or what Saint Francis didn't say, and how we have to like use our words and our actions to preach the gospel. So, like, I knew this guy one time, and like when you would talk to him, like he made like everything about Jesus, like everything. So, is there a line you draw there, or um,
Yeah, you mean like in an annoying way, like
I
what?
get it, but like
Yeah,
I'm saying, like, uh, obviously, like you want to preach the gospel and stuff, but do you draw a line so where you're not preaching it like all the time, I guess?
yeah. Well, I mean, it always has to be sort of some. It always has to be a like a direction you're going with your conversations. But it doesn't have to be like every 5 seconds you're talking about it, right? Where you've got to give people a chance to digest what you've said. You've got to give, it's got to, so I always think about the example of like God in the Old Testament, right? Like he doesn't dump everything on them all at once, right? He gives them a little bit in a way that they can understand because they're living in this culture that has many, many gods. And so he comes and he shows himself to be the true God. And he's like, okay, like that's enough for right now. Um, so I mean, our whole goal is not to just like, I think this is maybe a little bit of a more of a Protestant thing, to just preach, 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 preach. It's to introduce the person to Christ, right? So that like he's the one that's going to change them, right? And so if we're going to introduce them to Christ, there's all kinds of ways to do that, and it doesn't necessarily, you know, and it probably shouldn't be like every second, like Jesus this, Jesus that. And I don't mean that in a like a disrespectful way. I just mean it more in the sense of we have to also like be practical in the way that we're moving the person, right? So if you turn off and go, you know what, I don't want to tell this person about Jesus. Well, that wouldn't be right. But if you're like, okay, I need to use some prudence here because I know how they're going to respond. That's different, right? So your goal is still the same, but your method changes based on the situation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I have like two quick questions, but they're kind of pertain more to last week. Is that fine?
Yeah, that's perfect.
So first, like, so when you're in like desolation and prayer, like, how do you know you're not just like praying wrong? Like, I haven't gotten like any consolation like the past month other than like on Easter. Like, am I like, do you like, how do you know if you're like praying? I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Yeah. So usually the clearest way is you're still praying. So in other words, you have this desire for God, and um, but you can't find him, right? And so you're almost like this is where like the Song of Songs, the first few chapters of Song of Songs will really help you because it'll sort of resonate in your heart, and that sort of activates you a little bit. Um, but normally, like the did I do something wrong to make this happen? Usually, kind of resolves itself once you realize, well, even if I had something else, it wouldn't be what I want. Like, so you have to ask, do I still desire God? And if you do, then that's prayer, right? Yeah, and that's just, God's working, working in a certain area of your life, and it takes a little while, and He doesn't want you to, consolations. I think we talked about this already. As you grow to a certain sort of level of prayer, consolations tend to go away anyway, because we can get sort of addicted to them because they feel really good, right? Like and so God knows, all right, he's like, okay, Aaron needs a little boost today, so I'm gonna give her a little consolation. But in the end, like, think that your default should be desolation. Like that's how it is. Because we've got to move beyond sort of feeling, or even the good things that God does. Like those are just gifts, and He wants us to look at the gift maker. And if He kept doing that, we'd easily get attached to it, right? We'd easily go, I'm gonna go pray because I really like doing that because it feels good. And he doesn't want that, right? He wants us to go pray because we want to be with him. So I would say that to sort of answer your question, I would just check your desire. Like, are you still going to prayer, going, I really want God? um, and if you're not, then you need to sort of back up and look and say, okay, well, what's going on with me? But if you are, then just understand that this is part of the growing process, and it's okay. um, The only thing I would say that is like, as you enter into prayer, especially if desolation goes on for extended period of time, just make sure that the first prayer out of your mouth is, God, whatever you want to do here. Like, I accept the desolation, and then thank him for it, because it ultimately is for your good, right? Like, he's like, okay, I know how to make Aaron grow. I'm going to sprinkle this, I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of this on here today. And it's going to be really dry, but that's okay. And so thank him. Like, to me, when with desolation is the time where I really focus on gratitude. Um, and this is where like journaling helps, because if especially when you're consolation, but just go back and go like, well, thank you for those graces on Easter. That was great. Um, and don't sweat it as if God's chastising you. That's actually a sign of maturity, right? Where, okay, he's like, okay, Aaron doesn't need those. She doesn't need the lollipops anymore. Like, I'm gonna give her the meat. And usually that's how it's gonna be. And you just have to not get discouraged. Understand that like the perseverance is a sign of God staying there, because no one in their right mind would go, yeah, I'm getting nothing out of this, I'm gonna sit here for 30 minutes, unless God was giving you grace. So desire, um, perseverance are the two things, and gratitude.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then second, so I was talking to Casey, and we were talking about like how like the Christian way isn't like just doing like good thing. You want to do like the best thing.
Mm-hmm.
So like, which is like discernment in general, like religious life and like married. Like, if you feel a desire for religious life and that is the best thing, why wouldn't you go and like follow it? But like, you also have a strong desire for marriage. Just like discernment in general. Like, how do you not follow your emotions, kind of, and like, yeah, just any
Yeah.
tips?
So have we gone through like the sort of the steps of discernment? Did we talk about this already?
I don't remember. I don't.
Okay. So like the first thing is obviously like, okay, can I do, like, is the thing like a good thing, right? And then if it's a good thing, okay, then the next question is it good for me, right? And that's usually the one we struggle with, right? Where, okay, is this thing a good for me? And normally, what we do with that is we do go where our heart is kind of pulling us, because God does work that way. But then we ask for objective signs outside of that, right? Where, okay, if you're pulling me, if you're pulling me to marriage, um, you know, it's somewhat easier, because it's always pushed towards a specific person, right? Like, you don't sort of discern marriage in general. You discern marriage to a specific person. So if you don't have anyone in your life, you wouldn't go, I don't really know. I haven't gotten my call yet, right? And so that's the time where you're sort of going, okay, I'm being called to religious life, right? And so if you're in a situation where you're in like a serious relationship, you would be looking for signs that God's calling you out of it, right? And it would be more than just like, I really feel this pull there. Like, that would be a start of it, but you'd really have to go back and go, okay, what are the objective signs that I'm being called out of this, right? And that's always check like objective signs. And one of the ways you can do that is just simply ask God for a sign, right? Where you just say, okay, God, if you want this, then make X happen. This is why, like Mary, right? Like Mary, what's the first thing she does, right? Like, she asked the angel for a sign, right? And she's not because she doesn't believe, but because she's like, okay, if maybe I'm just having this experience. Um, and so she really wants it to be true, but she's like, okay, what's the sign? And then she runs off to find her cousin, because God's given her a sign. So in those moments, I mean, it obviously, this is very generic, because it's just a specific thing, but if you don't have clarity, then sometimes it's just a good thing to just sit with it for a little while, right? Where maybe now is not the time. Yeah, I don't know if that helps. I mean, it's kind of generic, but normally, unless something is like saying stop, you go in the direction where your heart is, kind of leading you. And then you got to ask that. You got to ask, like, okay, is this what you want, God? Is this what you want? And give me something objective.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, that helps. It's just like, it's like one day it's like this, the next day it's like that. So
Yeah, I think you just kind of stick with the direction you're like, especially when you're in desolation, right? When you're in desolation, like, if you've made a decision about something for the time being, stick with it until you're out of desolation.
thank you.
Any other questions?